Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm Mark Lagon, president of Freedom House. Thanks for coming to the museum, which is a truly wonderful host to talk about the Freedom of the Press 2015 report and to talk about what press freedoms mean to the citizens and governments around the world. I'm wearing a bracelet today for the cause called Press Uncuffed. It is an effort funded by the Knight Foundation and conceived by University of Maryland students to think about journalists who have been in line of fire. On my bracelet here, it says Jason Rezian's name, the Washington Post correspondent who's being held in Iran. I wish I could report that press freedoms were on the rise. They ain't. Unfortunately, the reality is very different, and it's troubling. Journalists are facing greater and greater pressure from all sides. Pressure from restrictive laws, pressure from political parties, pressure from media owners, pressure from militant groups, and sometimes at the cost of journalists' lives. The members of our distinguished panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, will use the main findings of our annual report as a starting point for their discussion, which will include questions from you. Before I introduce the panelists, I must thank the supporters who made our press freedom research possible and continue to do so. All of them really recognize the importance of press freedom to democracy and to the protection of fundamental human rights. Those supporters include the Helens Poston Foundation, the Herford Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, the Schloss Family Foundation, Stiftung Demokratie and Media, Press Freedom Unlimited, the Frit Ord Foundation, and the Reed Foundation. And all of us at Freedom House, we wouldn't be able to do our work if it weren't for your support and help. Our moderator today is Dana Priest. She's a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize and has long focused on national security issues and on reporters' coverage of those issues at the Washington Post. And she teaches at Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Kevin Kallaugher, also known to his readers as Cal, is the cartoonist of The Economist, where no chief of state is truly safe from his pen and his sense of humor. Cal is the winner of this year's Herb Block Prize for Excellence in Editorial Cartooning and a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and he's received virtually every major award in his field, both in Europe and the United States. And this is a moment in which we see how cartoonists, as satirists, and those who focus the mind have been under pressure. I want to welcome Thanassis Cambanis from Beirut. He's author of Once Upon a Revolution, a fine account of the rise and the steep decline of revolution in Egypt. He's reported in depth from throughout the Middle East, where threats to a free press are at their most extreme, and threats to journalists too. Vanessa Tucker, my teammate, vice president for analysis at Freedom House, and co-author of Freedom of the Press in 2015, is also on this panel. She'll begin our conversation by talking to us about the most important changes and themes that have emerged from the research for this report. Then Dana will lead the discussion as moderator of the panel, and we'll take some of your questions on note cards that we'll collect during the course of this. So thank you, Vanessa, Cal, Thanassis, and Dana. You're on.
Thank you, Mark. And welcome to everybody, especially those of you who aren't from the United States, where for every journalist imprisoned who's American, there are tens and many more than that overseas who are in trouble. So a special welcome to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to tell you, the news is bleak. The past year has seen a number of brutal and public murders of journalists for nothing more than attempting to do their jobs. Our report this year demonstrates that journalists are facing pressures from all sides. Governments, democratic and otherwise, are limiting critical coverage and restricting reporting on public discontent and corruption. Militant groups and criminal gangs are using violence and intimidation to silence coverage that exposes their brutality. Media owners are using their financial leverage to control reporting and shape it in favor of their own economic and political interests. These increasing pressures have an impact on all of us. When journalists are targeted, so is our access to information. And in 2014, we all suffered. Global press freedom declined in 2014 to its lowest point in more than a decade. The rate of this long-running decline also accelerated. Things are getting bad, and they're getting bad faster. We're not just talking about isolated cases here. We're talking about Europe, Eurasia, Asia, the Americas, the Middle East and North Africa, virtually everywhere in the world. In 2014, only 1 in 7 people lived in countries where political news coverage was robust, where journalists were safe, where government intrusion into the news was minimal, and where the press was free of onerous legal pressures. That means that in this entire room, fewer than 10 of us would have that kind of access to information. What does the news look like for everyone else? In some places, it's no news at all. In others, it is elaborate and sometimes completely fabricated propaganda. Politics are whitewashed of opposing views and dissent of any kind, and reporting about corruption is nothing more than populist slogans and rhetoric. Real information about foreign policy, about the economy, about corruption, about public safety, about issues that affect our everyday lives are neatly packaged to reflect the views of those in power. We are facing a paradox. In a time of seemingly unlimited access to information delivered in countless number of ways, access to unbiased information is facing challenges from left and right. The underlying reasons for these barriers are subtle, but that in many ways makes them more of a threat. The first underlying cause we found this year was a wave of restrictive laws against press, most of which limited speech based on grounds of national security. Detentions on the basis of security or emergency laws also increased this year. Some of the worst offenders here include Thailand, Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, where a group of bloggers reporting on political and social issues are now in jail and facing the death penalty on charges of terrorism for nothing more than blogging and encouraging their fellow Ethiopians to fight for their rights under the Constitution. Journalists are also facing physical barriers more and more and are therefore less able to report freely, particularly from areas of conflict. Much of Syria, Iraq, parts of northeastern Nigeria, Libya, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, all closed virtually due to terrorist and insurgent activity. Some of the biggest conflicts in the world are virtual black boxes to us. Perhaps some of this does not come as a surprise. Many of these countries are cracking down on broader freedoms, and so it might seem that crackdowns on press freedom are just part of a larger problem. But democracies are also struggling with issues both obvious and subtle. The law was used to restrict press freedom in South Korea and in South Africa, for example, where an apartheid-era law about national security is being used to prevent journalists from reporting on corruption among public officials. Gangs and local authorities hoping to limit reporting on organized crime and corruption in Mexico, Honduras, and other Central American countries used violence and intimidation to shut journalists out. Press freedom suffered right here in the United States, even, for the detention and harassment of journalists who were covering the Ferguson, Missouri protests. The The threats to press freedom that emerged and grew in 2014 will continue to challenge our access to information in democratic countries, particularly as governments decide how to counter terrorist attacks and genuine threats to national security without resorting to the tactics of their authoritarian counterparts. For this reason, it is vitally important that we remember that freedom of information is a pillar of democracy and not a threat to it. Restrictions on political information are sometimes an expedient way to respond to national security threats, but the most effective and sustainable long-term solutions are those that begin with open debate. That's a conversation that we at Freedom House are excited to have, and I'm excited to have right now with our fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, I wanted to start with Cal, in part because probably one of the highest profile events against journalists this year came in Paris against the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. So I wanted to ask you two questions. One is to tell us about the cartoonists we may not have heard about that are in peril, but to ask you, have you ever once thought to yourself, maybe I shouldn't draw this because of the dangers out there?
Well, two great questions. The first, when you're in this business, particularly in the international sphere as a cartoonist, you know that you're dealing almost with a hand grenade when you have a cartoon in your hand, because it's the potential to really upset people, because for some reason a cartoon, this combination of picture and satire woven together, seems to affect people in a very powerful way, unlike sometimes the written word. So as you described earlier, that there's about 14% of the people in the world live with a free press, but in that world of the 86%, the cartoonists who live in that world have a particularly hard time. And although a lot of attention this year has been cast upon those who delve into the delicate area of religion in their cartoons, the cartoonists in that 86% area really are suffering at the hands mostly of autocratic regimes and with all the kind of issues that all the other journalists suffer from. And we've had a few interesting cases this year that still are live now. A cartoonist in Malaysia named Zunar, who he's being attacked by the government, and it looks like that he may go to jail for 42 years because of his activities. We've had cartoonists in Colombia, in Pakistan, and
Turkey.
And Turkey is a great one because Erdogan, the president of the country, obviously has a very bad record with journalists, but he has a particularly bad record amongst cartoonists because he singles them out for having laws of attacking the president. And had one cartoonist a couple of years ago, he was suing for $1 million. So it's kind of it's a tactic that, because cartoons can reach maybe more people than an article might, politicians around the world see them as a particular threat and tend to go after them. In regards to my work, I think that every time you put pen to paper, you're always aware of what the impact might be and how people might absorb it. I have to tell you that during this time, a lot of people have been asking me, where do you draw the line? Where is the line drawn? And I'm going to conjure a cartoon in your mind on this, because when you say draw the line, it does kind of gives you a picture of a stick and a line being drawn. And I'd like to say that I see there's two lines. One line is a line that's actually a wall. And for us in the 14%, it's a wall that guards us. It's a wall of freedom that protects us in that realm against the battery of abuse and danger. But then there's this other line, and that's a line in the sand, a line that moves around. And this is the line of what's tolerable, what's culturally acceptable, and what would be journalistically sound in an effective cartoon. And that moves around all the time. It changes over time and space. For example, we all know what television was like in the 1950s compared to what's on HBO today. So things can change and move around. So when I'm conjuring up a cartoon, I have to be aware of this kind of moving line and what what takes place. But I know that my life is not because I work for The Economist and the Baltimore Sun, two robust organizations that really support freedom of speech. I'm in a lot safer place than many of my colleagues.
Okay, let's go to one of the hottest regions in this debate here, which is the Middle East. And Thanassis is visiting us from Beirut, just having published a book about Egypt. Talk a little bit about what's gone on in Egypt recently in terms of press freedom and reporters jailed and killed.
Well, the big theme is that the forces that would silence and repress journalists have gotten much more sophisticated, both about the importance of information and about their alternative ways of spinning the story themselves. So just in the 12 short years that I've been based in the Middle East, the nature of repression and danger has really accelerated and changed. So 12 years ago when I was in Baghdad, the big dangers for Iraqi reporters, first it was Saddam's regime, later it was the US military maybe targeting them, and then later it was the mayhem of all the different combatant groups. Now, 12 years later, we have, in Egypt, we have a regime that has put foreign reporters in prison, has killed a few local reporters, has put far more in prison, deported them, intimidated them, and at the same time has created its own alternate streams of propaganda. And so in the region today, you face, Vanessa mentioned the Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Sinai, but if you're an Egyptian reporter or a foreign reporter working in Egypt, when you can't go to the Sinai, not because of the militant groups, but because the government will stop and detain you before you can even drive across the provincial border. If you get there, the threat of kidnapping or killing from the Al-Qaeda affiliate there is much smaller. What we see, though, is threats from ISIS in Syria, from the regime in Syria, from the regime in Egypt, occasionally from our own bombs falling in Iraq and Syria. Just last month, in a case that hasn't really been, I think, publicly discussed much, an international agency in Iraq reported in great detail, did one of the things that I think we really want the press to do, detailed with great reporting, crimes against humanity or war crimes committed by the Shia militias in the invasion of Iraq, of Tikrit. And I believe the staff of that agency has stopped working since then because of threats against them. And that is, that might not have come directly from the government, which we back, but from its local allies. But this is the nature of that threat. So for the international staff leave, the local staff stop working, and maybe they fear for their lives as well. And we're absorbed in this crossfire from two directions. And the one is people trying to silence journalists directly by intimidation or killing them. The other is the effort to drown out their work. And I'll just end with one it's not a funny anecdote, but when ISIS took over the eastern part of Syria at the end of last year, their media office published a detailed list of guidelines for reporters. And it was a code of conduct which, to me, read uncannily like the guidelines issued by the Coalition Press Center in Baghdad when the U.S. Took over in 2003. But if you didn't know that these guys routinely behead people and publicly torture them, the rules and regulations were the same, responsible ethics, as long as your reporting is fact-based and doesn't reveal operational security compromising details. And this is the kind of minefield that reporters have to navigate.
Let me follow up with a question on the web, because in the Arab Spring we saw the web being used very cleverly to mobilize. How's the web being used now for online journalists or for bloggers? Are they able to work around press censorship, press state surveillance? Have states been able to close down that?
I mean, it's a great sort of, it's a mixed achievement because in Egypt today, for example, we have access to reporting information by Egyptian reporters who are working largely online that simply didn't exist under Mubarak or even in the 5 years ago towards the end of his regime. So Egyptians writing in English online, sometimes writing in Arabic online, are able to publish not just opinion and analysis, but reported fact that simply did not exist. And this is a victory of the web. I mean, an example in January, on the anniversary of the uprising, there was this case that attracted a lot of attention where this young mother was murdered almost at point blank by the police. They were holding silent vigil during the 4th anniversary of the uprising, completely unprovoked. The police came in, shot her in the face. She bled to death on camera. This was recorded by cell phone videos and also by a journalist who was there on the scene. All that footage and all the testimonies of the people who were there was almost within a day published and available online in Arabic, in English, some on Facebook, some on media outlets. So today the government is prosecuting, obviously not the policeman who murdered this woman, but the witnesses who testified and the people who dared to violate the law by protesting that day. But there is this body of evidence that's been published publicly, and that is, it's not going to change the amount of freedom or the relationship of power, but it does mean that we have this record, which simply wouldn't, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would have been a he said, she said. We might not have believed the government, but we wouldn't have known. Now we know how they're lying and exactly what they're lying about.
Good. So Vanessa, I wanted to have you focus on a region that seems particularly to have moved backwards together, which is the former states of the Soviet Union, and Russia in particular, because they're sort of leading the way on that. So starting with Russia, paint the picture. If you're in Russia watching television, do you have any chance of getting the truth?
Unfortunately not. One of the tasks I had in working on this report was going back through some of the examples of propaganda, and it's laughable, it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. I mean, I'm not sure that people always realize, one of the things about the web and all of these other new sources of technology is that those are also avenues for spreading propaganda. So some of the things that we're looking at are completely fabricated cases of victims, for example, reporting on a 9-year-old girl who was killed in the fighting, and all of the blame, of course, is going to the conflict's foes, according to Russian TV. And yet, this is a completely fabricated case.
This is in Donbass.
Exactly. There's no 9-year-old girl. Cases where there's filming of supposedly a concentration camp that is being built by the Ukrainian government, the idea of which apparently, as is being reported, that this will be where Russian speakers in Ukraine will be kept. As it turns out, this is just it's a state facility that is absolutely not a concentration camp. So when you look at how extreme the propaganda is, we're not just talking about bias in one direction or the other, just looking at one side of the conflict. We're looking at completely fabricated sources of information. And so I think that if you are a viewer or a reader in that context, it's not a question of weeding out some of the bias. The kind of imagination you would need in order to really understand the truth, it's almost impossible. We saw that in the entire region, and really Russian media across the region trying to use this kind of fabricated propaganda in order to gin up support elsewhere. And that's going to be a real challenge in the next few years, is figuring out how to counter that kind of propaganda without resorting to propaganda of your own. And that's one of the things we noticed in Ukraine, for example. Some of the Russian channels were shut down in an effort to silence this sort of insightful propaganda. That's a really slippery slope. It's really, it's not something that we would advocate, shutting down views as opposed to putting out actual genuine information. Estonia is a good example where instead of shutting down those channels, they actually are creating a Russian language channel in order to put out to their Russian-speaking population unbiased information about what's actually going on, so that people have the ability to decide for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And then if you look at Hungary, which I think we're all very surprised that it's moved backwards, and in this area in particular, Orban, the prime minister, is very pro-Kremlin. And is he looking to Putin as inspiration in what he's doing?
You know, so many, this is a problem in a lot of different contexts. And absolutely, I mean, the Russian government is using its tactics and its tools, and not just spreading them on its own, but looking to friendly governments and teaching those governments how they can do this. That's certainly the case with Hungary. Another country where we see that is China. So much of China's media is not just a problem in terms of censorship within its borders, but using those tools, controlling coverage about China outside of its borders, literally across the world, and exporting those technologies and tactics so that other governments elsewhere can do the same thing.
So the spread of surveillance technology is huge. It's affected every region I think we've talked about. And I would invite all of you to look at RT TV, Russian television, RT.com. And it wasn't like this 5 years ago, but now it's the most fabricated, wild kind of interpretation of what's going on in the West. And you'll see even there are bus stops now that have that feature RT TV. It says something like, for a second opinion, and it's so clever because they'll take the whole weapons of mass destruction fiasco and say, this was a fabrication by the U.S. government, and for a second opinion, come to RT TV. So they're fairly sophisticated at doing
Absolutely.
And making a big push here too.
It would be very hard, I think, as an outsider who does not, if you don't know a lot about the context of media censorship, it would be very hard to see through that and say, actually this is complete nonsense. It's a very sophisticated campaign.
Yep. So I wanted to come back, Cal, because I don't think you answered my question.
Oh, okay.
Can you give us, which was, when you're drawing a cartoon, have you said to yourself, I'm not going to draw this one? Like, have you gotten halfway through one and said, I better not do this?
Well, of course, the first thing is that working in the West, working for a publication, your first wall is your own editor in the newspaper, because the magazine and the newspaper don't have to print everything that you present them.
Does that happen often with you?
No, actually, not too often, partly because both of these publications give me an enormous amount of freedom. But with all freedom comes responsibility. And the responsibility in my case is, well, first, you don't want to do something that's sexist or racist. You have to do something that's journalistically sound. They certainly don't censor the point that I want to make. It's always a question of how you get across. So it's an editing of the best way to present your voice as you move forward. And also, I'll know that there are cartoonists in the West and here in the U.S. that get death threats, that get intimidation, but different than some of the people we've been talking about thus far. They don't get state intimidation. They don't get group intimidation. Instead, although we get our lion's share of people upset with our cartoons, and everybody does, but you worry about the lone wolf with a gun. That's kind of what you get threats, and that's kind of the things you worry about. Whenever I'm doing any cartoon, the area that you always watch out for is your metaphors and your delivery mechanism. Where you're going to mostly inadvertently offend somebody. You don't mind advertently offending somebody, but you do it by accident. It's usually, people, if you draw usually a racial stereotype in the wrong way, people might read it the wrong way. Also, because you're dealing with humor, people don't always get the joke and they might misread it. Those are kind of your danger areas. And in my case, particularly when I worked for The Economist, which is an international, and it's read by all sorts of people who can misread things or not understand metaphors. that you have to kind of use images that are going to translate over lots of different places. So you tend to be a little bit safer and not as risque. But inevitably, the cartoonists, all I know in the US, they get in trouble. It's usually the metaphors that they employ. So let's talk about pulling back. In the US, we have certain hot buttons. We have race, we have Arab-Israeli relations, we have abortion, we have guns, and things like that. Every time you do that subject, you're going to get a lot of heat and a lot of pushback. And so when you delve in that area, you just want to make sure that you're not supplying enough ammunition for your opponents to be able to hurl back in your face. And so that's kind of where I'm always hesitant. It's less like saying, ooh, I can't go there. It's more like, how am I going to approach this in the cleverest, smartest, apt, and most effective way? Did I answer your question this time?
He didn't give me an example yet, but
You can try me again.
we'll get you again.
Yeah.
Since we were talking about surveillance over here, are you familiar in the Middle East how states are using technology, maybe imported from China, maybe imported from the U.S., maybe some of our cyber security friends?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've done a fair amount of reporting about that, and I've also been subject to it. There's a couple of different approaches, and yes, these governments have been way ahead of us in terms of surveilling people, and when they can afford it, they get the technology. Egypt famously literally sliced off the internet in 2011. They sent a technician who either sawed or cut through the main cable to the internet that went to the country's main ISPs, and that was embarrassing to them for a number of reasons. So they have bought U.S. technology since subsequently to be able to engage in a much more targeted shutdown and also more sophisticated control. There are the Syrian government as well has been very, very resourceful at using the internet to both harass and infiltrate and surveil its opponents. They don't have the technological capacity to hack into Skype, which is a big, Skype and Viber are the main ways that dissidents and militants communicate, and also that we use to report on Syria since we can't go there anymore. And so what the government has done largely, and quite intelligently, they have hacked into people's accounts. And that, one thing that they do is they will capture an activist while they're logged in, and then the arrest won't be made public, and they'll continue to communicate with that person's sources on Facebook and Skype, and they'll use that to suck up a lot of information and identities of dissidents and critics. There are cybersecurity experts who have volunteered to go and work with dissidents around the region, and what a lot of them tell me is that the existing protections and workarounds are too complicated for people to use. So they'll train people on how to use proxies and other more sophisticated ways of browsing, communicating, and it's either too slow or too complicated, and most of them choose not to employ those methods. I would say that. Because the communities of interest are smaller and are relatively well known by these mammoth intelligence apparatuses in the Arab world, people really are quite carefully watched. I mean, we know our phones are actively listened to, as opposed to.
How do you know that?
Sometimes because we'll be visited by intelligence agents who have heard our calls. I mean, there are sort of funny things where someone will get a call from Israel in Lebanon, which is against the law for there to be any communication between Israel and Lebanon because they're still in a state of war. And a minute later, the phone will ring and it'll be state intelligence saying, who just called you. So sometimes it's that transparent. In Egypt, people will come and visit your house, and you get, competing intelligence agencies. So you say, hey, I already gave my information to the intelligence agent at the press ministry, and which agency are you from? And no, well, I'm from the phone company. And so sometimes you can see it. Other times it's more discreet. But and it when people get arrested. You go interview people, they get arrested. You go interview people, they get interrogated afterwards. So you can, they make a show of showing that they have heard you and are watching you, because that's part of their technique of intimidation.
First of all, if you have questions and you want to pass them, I think we have cards. If anyone wants to pass your cards back, and we'll take your questions in a minute. Let's turn to Hong Kong, because that's relatively new. What are the Chinese able to do in Hong Kong? Do they control the internet totally like they do in China already? Is there more than one provider?
So something interesting that we've seen in Hong Kong is that it's not just the Chinese government. It's also Chinese hackers that are very likely affiliated with the government. But there are a range of ways in which that kind of control can come into play. So one, similar to the case with Russia that we discussed earlier, one of the problems we saw this year in both Hong Kong and Taiwan was a huge cyber attack against Apple Daily, which is a major newspaper there. And so the newspaper was shut down completely. And when you see something like that happen in what are relatively small media markets, that has a huge impact on people's access to information. So it's not just that one source has been silenced, it's that a major source in a relatively small market with very few other options has been silenced. So that's one area that we've seen that China has controlled the message within Hong Kong. It still, to be sure, is a more liberal environment than China itself, but China is finding more and more ways to clamp down on that in ways that might not be immediately obvious.
And is the physical intimidation of reporters going on? I know we had that one editor who was attacked, and I think the assailants are unknown, but
right.
People suspect that it was somehow China directed. Are there other journalists that get hauled in for questioning or any other kind of intimidation of them?
Yeah, so within China, one thing that we noted this year was that the kind of intimidation that we've seen in past years has actually ramped up. There was a hope for a while that with Xi Jinping coming to power that there would be a liberalization of some kind. In fact, the investigative reporting, the kind of real in-depth journalistic work, that even some of it, which could have been done before, there's less and less of it now. So we're seeing that people are responding to new restrictions that the government is setting, new daily directives on what can and cannot be covered. They're responding to that both through self-censorship, through direct censorship when they try to cross those lines, and through direct intimidation from representatives of the government.
So I wanted to counter all the bad news with some, reporters are wily, clever people and have figured out a way throughout history to get around oppressive governments and now technology. So can people here think of the ways that they're continuing to do investigative reporting, or are cartoonists seeking protection from others to publish their work? I don't know.
Well, I know that you talked about blogs and moving to the web, that cartoonists who can no longer find a safe haven on newspapers, partly through intimidation, that they are now going to the web and finding a great home and maybe reaching larger audiences than ever before. And I know that happened to a cartoonist in Pakistan. One of the top cartoonists there decided, because the newspaper had been attacked so many times and his life threatened and his editor had actually been physically attacked, that he stopped doing cartoons for the paper, but now has a very robust audience on the web.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of success stories within this climate of slaughter and oppression. And I mean, the two examples that leap to mind. One is the work in Iraq. I mean, we have, from last summer when ISIS took over Mosul all the way through this campaign in Tikrit, we have names and details of acts committed by the Iraqi army, by allies of ISIS, by these Shia militias, and this is something that 10 years ago didn't even exist, right? We would know that if something had happened, we would know there had been a massacre or some kind of war crime committed. Today, we have published the name and rank of the militia leader who ordered the killing of these hundreds of people, or the slaughter of the Iraqi army by the ISIS people in Camp Speicher, and that, I think, for the record, what that's worth. I don't know what that's worth, but I think that's great. In Egypt, it's more pronounced, and it's something that I think is worthy of a lot of our admiration, and I learn a lot from. We have these mostly young but very committed journalists who, they don't call themselves journalists, they call themselves activists, because what they're doing is an inherently political act. And they are documenting and publishing information about everything from, let's say, noteworthy political decisions taken by the dictatorship, all the way up to human rights violations, the arrests of 50,000 people, the summary trials that have led to more than 1,000 death sentences. These things are being chronicled, documented, and published by at great risk by these Egyptian journalists, and that is at a minimum part of the historical record, and at a maximum, I think it really does change the dynamics of power, and that, you know, even 10 years ago, a dictator, I think in any part of the world, could feel confident that if he or she, I don't know if we have many women dictators, but if they were willing to use enough force, they could really control the narrative and not only eliminate the future risk of, say, a war crimes trial, but really erase the risk of political dissent. And I think today that freedom for tyrants is gone. And I'm hopeful that it leads to openings in places around the world.
And it's gone largely because of social media as a reporting tool, correct?
I'm not sure. I think social media as a reporting tool has been helpful for connecting people, but actually the information, right? The information about what's happening inside courtrooms, inside prisons, inside torture sites is not coming because of social media. It's coming because of this, you know, people smuggling photographs of torture victims out of Syria or out of Egyptian black sites and handing them physically to a reporter and evading surveillance to do that. Those aren't being somehow emailed, uploaded, shared on Twitter. It's the same old techniques. Social media has been instrumental in getting people who would have never known each other to meet, and then they have these relationships that lead to these kinds of leaks and traditional reporting.
And the same thing is happening in Iran, where prisoners in Iran are able to communicate outside using various clever ways, and there's a whole literature now on prisons in Iran, what's going on inside. So it's fascinating. I guess I didn't mean so much social media. What I meant is small phones, you know, that act as cameras.
I think cell phone cameras, and then YouTube as a place to publish that has been instrumental, right? We've seen the insides of things that would have been a fantasy for a reporter, for anyone in the public, 40 years to know about, or even 10 years to know about. Okay,
so here are a couple questions. Should have brought my glasses. But I think this question is mainly about, in the face of all this, what is the most effective response from liberal governments such as the U.S.? So first of all, cut that in two parts. Well, how is the U.S.? Many of these countries we're talking about are U.S. allies. So obviously, if we're doing something, it's not working. But what is the U.S. government's level of interest in this issue?
You know, I think that as with so many areas of human rights, there is a sort of prioritization of press freedom, and sometimes when there's nothing else, it's certainly at the top of the agenda. But in the face of a number of complicated interests, it's perhaps much farther down and much lower than we would hope. One really troubling sign that you see in a lot of the more repressive contexts is pointing to the United States and saying, well, you know, we're just doing what you do, or we're just doing what they do in the United States. Surveillance, they do that there. National security laws, who in their right mind would say, you know, terrorist attacks, we don't have to respond. So it's really important for democratic governments to understand it's not just what they say in meetings, it's also how they behave publicly. And there needs to be a way in which citizens of other countries can see that the freedoms, media freedoms that we have here are very important, that they're a pillar of our democracy. And any way that you restrict those here sort of gives a ready-made excuse to other governments that want to do the same thing.
Well, when you mentioned the ranking of priorities in terms of our strategic interests, what comes to mind is that our military interests have always been defined as strategic, and our values such as free press and free speech are somehow dropped below that
Right.
and not seen as our largest, most important values. And
Right.
so as long as there's this false trade-off, we either have one or the other, how are you ever going to get out of that sort of vicious cycle?
Well, I think if I can just add to that, so it's really important to remember that it is a false trade-off. I think a really good example of this is Egypt, that has been a long-standing American ally. When the Mubarak regime fell, I think a lot of people were saying, well, what do we really push? What should we do? This is an ally. We don't. Should we let maybe softer goals of human rights and democracy, should we actually put those ahead of our strategic goals? Well, in so many cases, we didn't put them ahead, and we said, look, we'll get to that. We took the state line, the Egyptian government state line, and said, okay, we'll get to that later once stability has been reached. Well, where's the stability? I mean, it's been 4+ years now, and we haven't seen that these highly repressive policies that consistently put human rights and issues of democracy and press freedom, they consistently fall to the wayside, and we're just seeing more and more chaos.
Yep. So if you two were in the government and you had Obama's ear,
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
and you didn't have to make the argument, but maybe you had to figure out what might be the most effective way to deal with an Egypt at this point, or a Malaysia,
or
a Bahrain, or Saudi, or
I mean, I think there's a conceptual leap that we refuse to make, and it's a mistake. We have accepted this idea that stability takes one form, and it's the form of a unitary military, a unitary state that controls its military and that shares our security priorities. And we don't believe, as a government, that pluralism is actually stable. And now I do. This isn't an act of faith, right? This is as a result of what I've read in history and what I've observed in one short lifetime, is that societies with multiple power centers and multiple competing political entities and a government that is not under any single person or party's political control is actually more stable over the long term than one in which there's no rule of law, no rights, and no pluralism, both sort of in the soft power sense, but also pluralism in terms of where is power, how many centers have power. And I mean, it's useful to look at America, where people talk a lot about the sort of Praetorian military state we have. Yet, even if you believe in that analysis, there is no single person in America who controls everything. I mean, there's so many power centers, and that makes a huge difference. If we believe that, and if we were honest and acknowledged that we can't make anybody do anything, right? The U.S. government, even its allies, even Israel and Egypt, who get $2 billion plus a year from us, we can't tell anyone what to do, okay? And so that it's worth recognizing the limits of our influence. Yet, if we exercise our influence, it makes a huge difference. And when you talk about Bahrain, which is a tiny state that depends entirely for its survival on the United States, on our Fifth Fleet naval base there, and we have let them humiliate us over and over. We have let them do horrible things to activists and practitioners of free speech in Bahrain since 2011, and we even briefly experimented with public pressure, right? And it was one of the only places where, after the Arab Spring, U.S. State Department officials made public statements of solidarity and support for the activists in Bahrain. But eventually, we dropped it. And I think it would make a big difference if the U.S. said, "Hey, we've just done a cost study on moving the Fifth Fleet. We don't have to actually move it or exercise that threat. Do a study, publish it. I bet you Nabil Rajab would be let out of prison, even if briefly. So that's the kind of experiment with power in a context in which we acknowledge that pluralism is actually a necessary prerequisite for stability rather than a trade-off.
cartoonist, how would you?
Yeah, so it was interesting that as you asked me that question, I started to ponder that, as a cartoonist, we're always dealing in criticism. We're not always dealing with this notion of giving advice, positive advice. We're saying, you're doing this very wrong. And so I guess where we always look for in the story too is the seam, the point of hypocrisy. And that's what we try to expose. So I guess if I had his ear as a cartoonist, I would sort of say, now look, I see a lot of hypocrisy going on here. You have certain ideas and principles that you have at home, and when you're doing it abroad, your record's not so good. And not only that, we have foreign governments, bad guys, exploiting that for their own good. So I guess as a cartoonist, I would say it'd be bad for my job, but it'd be better for the country that you kind of reduce the hypocrisy quotient as much as possible.
I can see the panels now.
Right.
All right. Can you read that? I wasn't prepared for that part. Okay. Okay, I can read this one. How about the situation in Azerbaijan? And do they have any cartoonists there? That's what I'm going to ask next.
I visited there recently.
The situation in Azerbaijan is among the worst. It's one of the big declines of the year and certainly of the past 5 years. It's an area where you see this continuing deterioration, and certainly not one that we've seen much improvement at all in the past 5 years. So that's a case that we've drawn attention to in a number of ways, and also a case in which you can see the influence of outside actors really kind of pushing forward some of the restrictions that we've seen.
And they've thrown every investigative journalist
Exactly.
that there is in prison now.
Khadija Ismailova is a good case to watch there, and one that Freedom House has been quite active in pressing for change. Unfortunately, I think in terms of the future, we're not optimistic about what that looks like.
And to piggyback on that, one of the optimistic things that people are doing in the case of Azerbaijan, there's a group based in Europe that is continuing her work on the Aliyev family in order to say, look, you could put one person in prison, but that's not going to stop reporting on wrongdoing. So that's an example of groups responding in a creative way to some of this. I like the Fifth Fleet study. that could be. Okay, here's a good one for Cal. While never questioning the importance of freedom of the press, I need help in understanding why a cartoonist would choose to communicate his or her message by treating a sacred figure so disrespectfully.
Well, sure. Interesting question, and I think that we're assuming we're talking about the prophet here. That there's as many different kind of cartoonists as there are comedians. They have all different styles and approaches and what they subject matter they like to delve in. So when it comes to dealing that kind of subject matter, it's not the sort of thing that I would like to venture in. I don't understand that would be an area of political interest. But I think if we're talking specifically about the Charlie Hebdo situation, which is kind of unique in its way, everything kind of leads back to the Danish cartoonist event, which took place about 9 years ago. And just as a small summary so that people remember, a Danish book publisher wanted to do a children's book about the prophet, couldn't find any artist who would do it. When word got out to a newspaper in Denmark, they felt that this was an outrage that people wouldn't do this, so they approached 50 cartoonists and asked that we're going to do a page full of Muhammad cartoons, and 11 obliged, didn't get paid very much money, and then everything kind of broke loose from there. There was violent protests around the world, scores were killed, and the aftermath of it led up to the Charlie Hebdo event. So. The question was, if you go back to that, I think that was, for example, a stupid idea to do a page full of cartoons like that, which to me would be a bit of a stunt and poking your finger in the eye of a community. It's not something that I would do. I believe, going back to the wall metaphor, that those people should be legally allowed to say things like that and not certainly have their lives threatened. But I don't believe that was a wise thing to do. I wouldn't have done it myself. So, but that kind of conversation, what should be socially acceptable, and it's the fact that we can have it today and not worry about us being arrested or anyone taken away not to be seen again, I think that's the important thing, is that we can have that discussion about that. But it's got to be understood that it should be done face to face, not with gun to head.
The continent that we haven't talked about is Africa. Actually, we haven't talked about Latin America either. So unfortunately, we have 2 more continents to cover, and we're almost out of time. Do you want to mention a couple trends in Africa? I mean, Ethiopia and Eritrea are chronic problems.
Right.
So, are there new states there that are problematic?
Sure. So,
South Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa was actually the one region that had a very slight uptick in this year's findings, but I still find that there's not, unfortunately, much reason to be optimistic, because most of the cases that we noted there where there were improvements, it was because they were moving from a very low level and perhaps in a post-conflict situation or in a sort of...
We'll take it. We'll take
sure,
it.
we'll take it where we can get it. But back again to the bad news, South Africa is actually a case where people are very surprised to hear that the situation is quite bad. There is a deterioration in South Africa this year for a number of reasons. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that the National Key Points Act, which is an apartheid-era law for national security, it's being used to shut down reporting of all kinds. So it's supposed to be for very particular reasons, but then you see journalists who are trying to report on corruption hearing all of a sudden, no, that's actually that location's a sensitive subject, and so you're not able to report at all. It's in cases like that we think of as real regional leaders that that kind of deterioration is especially troubling.
So we're out of time, and that I want to conclude by saying we've left out all of Latin America and Central America and Mexico, and you should go to the Freedom House Index to read about it, because those are fascinating cases in themselves, and they're just our neighbors. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dana. Do see freedomhouse.org for the Freedom of the Press report. Vanessa, thank you. Dana, thank you. Thanassis, thank you. And thank you, Cal, and for that thought about reducing the hypocrisy quotient. We appreciate you all coming here, and there are bracelets available for people who would like to have them.